I will argue that the only thing that the United States were defending in Southeast Asia was their own interests. Their economic and advisory support was solely with the aim of stopping the spread of communism, regardless of whether they were supporting democracy or not. I will argue that the US were not defending democracy because they propped up Diem's autocratic regime and didn't agree to the Geneva Accords, which proposed free elections. However, the US did aid the French, who were a democracy, so to an extent they were defending the democratic status quo. Also, a very naive view is that they were defending democracy because that's what the Truman Doctrine promised. However, I will argue that this was only a front for the US to pursue their own ends. Now, I've also acknowledged here that we haven't bolted on to this notion of aiding the French, who were a democracy, that they were actually also the colonial and imperialist power in Southeast Asia, to which the United States was opposed, but pragmatically was prepared to accept in the aim of containing communism. Firstly, the most blatant evidence that the US were not defending democracy was their refusal to sign the Geneva Accords. The Geneva Accords temporarily partitioned Vietnam along the 17th parallel and arranged elections in 1956 to reunite Vietnam under one government. Northern forces had to withdraw from the South and vice versa. The French were to organise elections which would make Vietnam a democratic nation. The US feared that Ho Chi Minh would win these democratic elections, thus meaning that Vietnam would become communist. The US were fighting to stop this. Since the Geneva Accords, which Ho Chi Minh had agreed to, would establish a democratic Vietnam, and the US actively resisted them by creating SEATO, which gave them a backdoor into Southeast Asia, the US was certainly not defending democracy or doing anything to further it. They could not accept that a communist country could also be a democracy, so fought against democracy to prevent communism, even though they had the potential to be the same thing. Secondly, the most obvious way in which the US failed to defend democracy was by supporting Diem. Diem was a militant anti-communist, hence he came to the US's attention, and ran South Vietnam like a family business, with all positions of power being filled by his family. Now we call this nepotism. Not only did this go down poorly in a mainly Buddhist country, but Diem's regime was brutal and barbaric. To worsen matters, Diem pursued incredibly unpopular policies, to which there was no resistance as the country was not democratic in any way. Therefore, the US were not defending democracy, as they were giving Diem billions of dollars for him to run South Vietnam. However, it was not democratic. The US only supported him because he was anti-communist, not because he had promised to create a flagship democracy. So the US really were defending anything anti-communist in the region, but said that they were defending democracy as this looked better on the world stage. However, it was anti-communist action that won votes in America, thanks to McCarthy's demagoguery. This, of course, was the time of the McCarthy Red Scare. However, one could argue that the US were defending democracy because they were helping the French maintain their influence in the region, and the French were democratic. Well, they certainly were in Europe. The French were a European democratic nation who still had a worldwide empire before World War II. After the Second World War, the French tried to re-establish their colonial power in Southeast Asia, and the US payrolled the entire operation, contributing 80% of France's cost in the region, as well as the aid they were additionally giving to Europe through the Marshall Plan. The US would have rather had the French in power, a democracy that they knew and had diplomatic relations with, as well as some leverage over due to the Marshall Aid, instead of unknown, unpredictable and unstable new governments that they could not control. The US were defending democracy. They were helping the French assert their control over the region, which they had a legitimate claim to in the eyes of the French, and therefore maintain a democratic society in the region. By helping the French, the US were ensuring that democracy continued in the region, and this would stop any autocrats taking advantage of the state of flux after World War II and seizing power forcibly. I would, however, argue that since the US did not support empires, they helped the French because they thought that anything was better than communism. This is pragmatism. So they were fighting to maintain French democracy, and this was a facade behind which they pursued their policy of containment in Southeast Asia. Lastly, a very naive view would be that the US were fighting for democracy because this was what the Truman Doctrine promised. The Truman Doctrine stated that the US would defend their way of life, specifically a way of life based on the will of a majority, and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free election, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political aggression. This is pretty much the definition of a democracy, and this is what Truman had committed US resources to defend, whatever the cost. So the US were defending democracy in Korea because that is what they had committed to do. The Truman Doctrine stated that they would defend democracy, and this was the policy of it as it was being implemented in Vietnam. Officially, the US were only defending the Vietnamese liberty as an independent nation by stopping an armed minority seizing power. This is fighting for democracy as it is preventing the Vietnamese people being subjugated by an armed minority. To conclude then, while officially the US were defending the liberties of those unable to defend themselves and helping their ally to regain what was already theirs, these are only a front for the US's own aims, to contain communism. It is clear that they weren't defending democracy because Diem's regime was not democratic and the US didn't support the free elections proposed at Geneva. The US were only fighting to stop the spread of communism, so we're defending anything that wasn't communist in the region, whether they supported it or not.